On a Tuesday morning in July of 2012, Harlan Voss stood at the edge of his feedlot in Finney County, Kansas, and watched 11 years of careful breeding decisions die in the heat. Not all at once. That would have been merciful. They went one at a time. Over 4 days, the big Charolais and Simangus crossbreds he'd spent a decade selecting for frame score and average daily gain. The cattle that had won him 2 consecutive county fair championships and a feature in the regional Ag Extension newsletter. They went down in the afternoon when the temperature hit 108 degrees and the humidity climbed with it, and by the time the veterinarian had made his 3rd visit in as many days, Harlan had lost 22 head and the vet had stopped pretending there was much to be done. The heat index that week reached 116. The cattle weren't built for it. They never had been. He just hadn't known it yet. Let me tell you about Finney County in the summer of 2012, because you need to understand what that place was before you can understand what happened there. Finney County sits in the southwest corner of Kansas, flat as a table and twice as unforgiving, where the wind comes off the high plains in July carrying heat like a physical weight, and the sky turns a white that isn't quite blue and isn't quite anything else. The Arkansas River runs through it, mostly dry by midsummer, and the feedlots and cow-calf operations that define the county's economy had been built around one central assumption for the better part of 40 years. Bigger cattle finished faster and brought more money at the sale barn, and the genetics that produced bigger cattle were the genetics worth keeping. This was not a theory. It was not a philosophy. It was the air the county breathed. You selected for frame, you selected for growth rate, you selected for carcass weight, and you did not ask whether the animal carrying those genetics could stand in a Kansas feedlot in July without dying, because the question had never seemed worth asking. Harlan Voss was a good cattleman by every measure the county recognized. He was 44 years old in the summer of 2012, had been running cattle on his family's 1,800 acres since he was 19, and had spent the intervening years building a cow-calf and backgrounding operation that his neighbors respected and his banker was comfortable with. He subscribed to Beef Magazine and the Kansas Stockman. He attended the annual bull sale at the Kansas State Extension Service and took notes. He had replaced his original Hereford cow herd with Angus cross females in the late 90s, because the data on carcass quality was unambiguous, and he had layered in Charolais and Simmental influence on the terminal side because the frame and growth numbers justified the investment. By 2012, his operation was producing steers that averaged 1,400 pounds at slaughter and finished in 140 days on feed. The numbers were good. The system worked. Until July, when it didn't. The heat event that summer was not unprecedented in the historical record, but it was unprecedented in the memory of most working cattlemen in southwest Kansas. 7 consecutive days above 105 degrees. 4 of those above 108. Humidity that had no business being in the high plains but arrived anyway, pushed up from the Gulf through a stalled pressure system that the meteorologists had been tracking with visible concern for 2 weeks before it arrived. Cattle operations across the county lost animals. Some lost dozens. Harlan lost 22, which represented roughly 18% of his backgrounding pen, and the financial damage when you calculated the purchase price of the calves, the feed costs to that point, and the lost sale value came to just over $47,000. His insurance covered a portion of it. Not enough. What bothered Harlan more than the money, though, was that he drove past Nora Salazar's place on the county road 3 miles south of his own on the 5th day of the heat event, and her cattle were standing at the water tank looking annoyed but otherwise fine. Let me tell you about Nora Salazar because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from almost every character this channel has told you about. Not because she was young, though she was 23 years old in 2012 and had been farming her family's ground for exactly 2 years. Not because she was a woman in a county where the faces at the sale barn and the co-op and the extension office were almost exclusively male, though that was true and it mattered. She was different because she had come back to Finney County from Kansas State University with a degree in animal science and a notebook full of ideas that nobody in the county wanted to hear. And she had come back not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had chosen it, deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was walking into. That distinction mattered to her. It still does. Nora's family had run cattle in Finney County for 3 generations. Her grandfather, Aurelio Salazar, had come up from Chihuahua in 1958 and built a small cow-calf operation on 640 acres of leased ground that his son, Nora's father Miguel, had eventually purchased and expanded to 900 acres. Miguel Salazar was a methodical man, careful with money and careful with his cattle, and he ran an Angus cross herd that was indistinguishable in its genetics from every other serious cow-calf operation in the county. He was not a man who questioned the received wisdom of his industry. He had built something real by following it, and he was not inclined to experiment with what had worked. When Nora came home from Manhattan in May of 2010 with her degree and her notebook and her opinions, Miguel listened to her with the patient attention of a father who loved his daughter and the quiet skepticism of a man who had been farming for 30 years and believed that universities taught theory while the land taught truth. The cattle, standing calmly at Nora's water tank on the 5th day of the 2012 heat event, were Shorthorns, not purebreds exactly. Nora had been crossing her family's Angus cows with a registered Shorthorn bull named Dunmore's Red Admiral, a 3-year-old out of a Canadian line with moderate frame, deep red roan color, and a slick coat that lay tight against his body like a second skin. She had bought Admiral in the spring of 2011 for $2,800 at a dispersal sale in Pratt County, and the reaction at the Finney County Co-op when word got around had been approximately what she expected. Let me tell you about what happened at the Finney County Farm Bureau meeting in March of 2011, because it is the moment this story turns from a farming decision into something else. Nora had driven to the meeting in her father's pickup, which still had the Salazar Ranch logo on the door, and which she had not yet earned the right to call hers in any sense that the county would recognize. She was 22 years old. She sat near the back. The meeting was ostensibly about drought preparedness and hay pricing, but the conversation drifted, as it always did, toward cattle genetics, and specifically toward the upcoming spring bull sales, and what the performance data was showing for the current crop of Angus and Angus cross bulls being offered. The man holding court at the front of the room was Dale Crowley, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county at just over 4,000 head, had served on the Kansas Beef Council for 6 years, and whose opinion on genetics carried the kind of weight that comes not from being always right, but from being loudly confident for long enough that the distinction stops mattering. Dale was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, and wore his certainty, the way some men wear good boots, broken in, comfortable, and on display. Nora raised her hand when the conversation turned to heat stress and asked whether anyone had looked at the research on British dual-purpose breeds and their thermoregulatory efficiency relative to continental crosses. She had a specific paper in mind, published by a team at Oklahoma State in 2009, which had measured core body temperature maintenance in cattle of different breed compositions during sustained heat events, and found statistically significant advantages in certain shorthorn and shorthorn cross animals related to coat characteristics, sweat gland density, and metabolic heat production. She had the paper in her notebook. She had read it 3 times. Dale Crowley looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been interrupted by someone he did not expect to be interrupted by. Then he smiled. The smile was not unkind, exactly. It was the smile of a man who has decided that the most efficient response to something he finds irrelevant is to make it briefly amusing and then move on. He said that shorthorns were a fine breed for people who liked low weaning weights and mediocre carcass data, and that if she wanted to grow a show herd for the county fair, that was her prerogative, but that the feedlots buying cattle in southwest Kansas were paying for pounds and quality grade, and the shorthorn bull hadn't been born that could compete with what the Angus AI programs were producing. A few men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Now let me pause here and ask you something. What does a laugh like that cost? Not the man who laughs it. That's obvious enough. What does it cost the room? Because there were other men in that meeting who had questions they hadn't asked, doubts they hadn't voiced, things they'd noticed on their own operations that didn't quite fit the received wisdom, but that they'd filed away because the filing was easier than the conversation. Dale Crowley's laugh didn't just dismiss Nora Salazar. It told every other person in that room what the social cost of asking the wrong question was. It closed a door. It would stay closed for a while. Nora drove home without saying anything else. Miguel was in the kitchen when she got back, and she sat down at the table and opened her notebook and told him what she wanted to do. She wanted to purchase a registered shorthorn bull with specific heat tolerance characteristics and breed him to 40 of the family's Angus cows in the coming breeding season, keeping the resultant calves separate and tracking their performance data, weaning weights, average daily gain, feed conversion, and, critically, their behavior and body condition during summer heat events, against the straight Angus calves from the rest of the herd. She had a budget. She had a protocol. She had the OSU paper and 2 others from Texas A&M and the University of Queensland in Australia, where shorthorn cross cattle had been used in tropical beef programs for decades with documented results. She put all of it on the table in front of her father. Let me tell you about the science, because you need to understand what Nora understood before you can understand why she was right. Heat stress in cattle is not simply a matter of air temperature. It is a function of the heat load an animal generates internally through its own metabolic processes combined with the heat it absorbs from the environment, minus its capacity to dissipate that heat through sweating, respiration, and radiation from its body surface. Large-framed, fast-growing cattle with high feed intake and high metabolic rates generate more internal heat. Continental breeds, Charolais, Simmental, Limousin, and their crosses were selected in European climates where this was not a problem and in some cases was an advantage. They were not selected for heat dissipation. Their coats, their metabolic rates, and their sweat gland architecture reflected the environments that shaped them. The OSU study Nora had cited found that during a simulated heat event, shorthorn cross steers maintained core body temperatures an average of 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit, lower than Charolais cross steers of comparable weight and condition. That number sounds small. In a feedlot in Chot-July in southwest Kansas, it is the difference between an animal that keeps eating and gaining and an animal that stops eating, loses condition, and, in severe cases, dies. The Texas A&M data showed that heat-stressed cattle reduced dry matter intake by an average of 10 to 35% during sustained heat events, which translates directly to reduced average daily gain, and, at the extreme end, to the kind of mortality event Harlan Voss would experience in 2012. The Queensland program had been crossing British Shorthorn genetics into Brahmin-influenced tropical herds for 30 years, not because Shorthorns were fashionable, but because the data on coat characteristics and heat tolerance was consistent enough to act on. Nora also had numbers on carcass quality that she thought addressed Dale Crowley's objection directly. The modern Shorthorn, particularly the Canadian and Australian lines that had been selected for dual-purpose performance rather than dairy, was producing carcass data that had closed most of the historical gap with Angus on Marblein and Ribeye area. Not equal, she acknowledged that, but closer than the county's conventional wisdom reflected, and when you factored in the feed efficiency advantages during summer months and the reduced mortality risk, the per-head economics told a different story than the one being told at the Farm Bureau meeting. Miguel Salazar sat with all of this for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. He picked up the OSU paper and read the abstract. He set it down. He looked at his daughter, who was 22 years old, and had come home to farm ground that had been in the family for 54 years, and he said, "I need to think about it." He thought about it for 3 weeks. Then he told her she could use 40 cows in the south pasture, and that she would keep records of everything. He did not say she was right. He said he needed to see it. Dunmore's Red Admiral arrived at the Salazar Ranch in April of 2011 in a stock trailer that Nora had borrowed from a neighbor, and she unloaded him herself in the late afternoon with Miguel watching from the fence. Admiral was not an imposing animal by the standards of the county. He stood 5 feet 2 inches at the hip, weighed 1,780 pounds, and carried the deep red roan color of his line with a coat so slick and tight it caught the light differently than the woollier Angus bulls in the neighboring pastures. He was calm. He moved without urgency. He did not pace the fence or bellow at the cows across the road the way young bulls sometimes do. He walked to the water tank, drank for a long time, and stood in the shade of the lone cottonwood at the south end of the pasture with an air of patient self-possession that Nora would later describe when she told this story to the Kansas Livestock Association annual meeting, as the first sign she'd made the right decision. The co-op talk started within a week. Someone had seen the bull in the pasture from the county road and mentioned it to someone else, and by the time it reached Dale Crowley, it had already acquired the editorial coloring that county road gossip tends to acquire, which is to say, it arrived with the implication that the Salazar girl had bought a show bull with her college money and was playing at farming, while her father shook his head. Dale made a comment at the co-op counter that was reported back to Nora secondhand, something to the effect that he hoped she'd kept the receipt. She had not kept the receipt. She had no intention of needing it. The first breeding season went without drama. Admiral settled 37 of the 40 cows Nora had allocated to him, a conception rate of 92.5%, that was better than the 88% the family's AI program had averaged over the previous 3 years, though Nora was careful in her notebook not to draw too much from a single season's data. The calves came in the spring of 2012, red roan and red, and a few blacks that carried more of the Angus dam than the Shorthorn sire, and they were smaller at birth than the straight Angus calves in the adjacent pasture by an average of 6 pounds, which was the first number Dale Crowley would have pointed to if he'd been looking. Nora wrote it down and moved on. Let me tell you about the summer of 2012, because it is the reason this story is still being told. The heat event that killed Harlan Voss's cattle came to Finney County the second week of July, and it came with enough warning from the National Weather Service that most operations had time to implement whatever heat abatement protocols they had. which in most cases meant additional water access, shade structures if they existed, and reduced feeding during the hottest part of the day. These measures helped. They were not sufficient. The heat index on July 11 reached 116 degrees Fahrenheit, and it stayed above 110 for 4 consecutive days, and the cattle that were not built to handle it demonstrated that fact in the way that cattle always demonstrate physiological limits, which is by dying. Nora's Shorthorn cross calves were on pasture during the event, not in a feedlot, which matters because feedlot conditions concentrate the problem. More animals, more metabolic heat, less airflow, harder ground that radiates heat upward. But the pasture conditions that week were brutal by any measure, and the straight Angus calves in the adjacent pasture showed it. Nora documented everything. She walked both pastures twice daily during the heat event, recording body condition scores, respiration rates, time spent at water, and behavioral indicators of heat stress. Open-mouth panting, bunching in shade, reduced grazing activity. The Angus calves showed moderate to severe heat stress indicators on the 3rd and 4th days. 2 of them required veterinary attention. The Shorthorn cross calves showed mild to moderate indicators and recovered faster each morning when temperatures dropped. None required veterinary intervention. She wrote all of it down in the same notebook she'd brought home from Manhattan. What she also documented, because she had the presence of mind to keep tracking through the stress event rather than just managing it, was the impact on average daily gain. Cattle under heat stress eat less. Cattle that eat less grow less. The Angus calves lost an average of 0.4 pounds per day during the 4-day peak heat period and did not fully recover their pre-stress gain rates for 11 days afterward. The Shorthorn cross calves lost an average of 0.1 pounds per day during the same period and recovered within 5 days. Over the course of the summer, the cumulative effect of that difference on weaning weights was not dramatic. The Shorthorn cross calves weaned at an average of 547 pounds, compared to 571 pounds for the straight Angus calves. But when Nora ran the full economics, accounting for the veterinary costs on the Angus side, the feed efficiency numbers across the whole season, and the mortality risk differential that the heat event had made visible, the Shorthorn cross calves had cost less to produce per pound of weaned calf than the Angus calves by a margin that surprised even her. She put the numbers in her notebook. She did not go to the co-op and announce them. She went back to work. Harlan Voss drove past her pasture on the 5th day of the heat event, as I told you, and saw her cattle standing at the water tank looking annoyed but alive. He slowed down on the county road. He did not stop. He drove home and lost 3 more steers that afternoon and called his veterinarian and then sat in his truck in the driveway for a while doing the kind of arithmetic that a man does when he is trying to understand how a decision he made carefully and in good faith has cost him $47,000. He thought about the Salazar girl's cattle. He thought about the bull he'd seen in her pasture the previous spring, the red roan animal that looked too small and too calm and not like anything the county was running. He thought about it for several days before he did anything about it. Let me tell you about the fall of 2012, because the story does not end with the heat event. It begins there. Nora weighed and sorted her calves in September and sat down with her notebook and the calculator on her phone and produced a document that was 4 pages long and covered weaning weights, average daily gain by period, veterinary costs, feed costs, estimated carcass value based on current grid premiums, and a projected comparison of per-head revenue under 3 scenarios: straight Angus, Shorthorn cross at current performance, and a hypothetical fully optimized Shorthorn cross program with a second generation of selection. She showed it to Miguel at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in late September. He read it twice. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How many cows do you want next year?" She said, "All of them." He thought about it. He said 60. She took 60. She also called the Farm Bureau and asked to be put on the agenda for the November meeting. The November Farm Bureau meeting in Finney County was not a large event. 40-some farmers in a room at the extension office, folding chairs, bad coffee, and the particular atmosphere of rural Kansas in November, which is to say practical and unhurried, and not especially interested in being surprised. Nora stood at the front of the room with her 4 pages of data printed out and distributed to everyone present, and she walked through the numbers the way her animal science professors had taught her to walk through numbers, which is without drama and without apology, letting the figures carry the argument themselves. She talked about the heat event. She talked about the respiration rate data and the average daily gain differentials. She talked about the veterinary costs. She put the per-head economics on the whiteboard. Dale Crowley sat in the 3rd row. He had the handout in his lap, and he was looking at it with an expression that had started the meeting as mild amusement and was now something more difficult to read. He waited until she finished, and then he said that one season's data on 40 calves during an unusual weather event was not a basis for recommending a breed change to the county, that the Shorthorn's historical performance record in feedlot settings was well documented and not favorable, and that he would be cautious about drawing conclusions from a single summer. His voice had the same authority it always had, but something in it had shifted, slightly, in the way that a fence post shifts when the ground around it has been loosening for a while without anyone noticing. Nora said she agreed that one season's data was not a basis for a recommendation, which was why she was presenting it as data and not as a recommendation, and that she intended to continue the trial for at least 3 more years and would present updated results annually. She said she thought the county deserved to have the conversation. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the meeting moved on to hay pricing. But 3 farmers came up to her afterward. Not Dale Crowley. 3 others, men who had been in the county a long time and who had their own questions that they had not been asking. One of them had lost 8 head in the July heat event. Another had been watching his feed conversion numbers on his summer calves for 3 years and had noticed a pattern he couldn't explain. The 3rd one just said he'd heard about her bull and wanted to know more about the line. She gave all 3 of them her phone number and the citation for the OSU paper. Let me tell you about the 3 years that followed, because they are the years that built the argument. In 2013, Nora expanded the Shorthorn cross portion of the herd to 60 cows and continued tracking the same metrics. The summer of 2013 was cooler than 2012, no catastrophic heat event, and the performance gap between the Shorthorn cross and straight Angus calves narrowed, as she had predicted it would in the absence of significant heat stress. The Shorthorn cross calves weaned at an average of 541 pounds against 568 for the Angus calves. The per-head economics were closer. She wrote it down without alarm. This was what the data was supposed to do. It was supposed to tell the truth about all conditions, not just the favorable ones. In 2014, the summer was hot again, not 2012 hot, but 3 weeks in July that pushed consistently above 100 degrees and produced measurable heat stress in the county's cattle population. The Shorthorn cross calves outperformed the Angus calves on every heat stress metric Nora was tracking. The average daily gain differential during the heat period was 0.28 pounds per day in favor of the Shorthorn cross animals. The veterinary cost differential was $18 per head in favor of the Shorthorn cross animals, the weaning weight gap, which had been 27 pounds in 2012 and 27 pounds in 2013, was now 19 pounds in 2014, because the second-generation Shorthorn cross calves were beginning to express the growth potential that the breed's dual-purpose genetics carried. She ran the economics. The Shorthorn cross calves were producing more revenue per head than the Angus calves for the first time, by a margin of $34 per head, because the reduced veterinary and management costs during the heat period more than offset the weaning weight disadvantage. She put it in the notebook. She called the Farm Bureau and asked to be on the November agenda again. By the 2014 meeting, things had changed in small ways that mattered. Two of the three farmers who had approached her after the 2011 meeting had purchased Shorthorn bulls of their own. One of them, a man named Emmett Lindgren, who ran 200 cows north of Garden City, had been tracking his own data for one season and had numbers consistent with Nora's. He sat in the front row at the November meeting and nodded when she presented. Dale Crowley was also there. He did not say anything during the presentation. Afterward, in the parking lot, Nora saw him standing by his truck reading her handout in the cold November light. He did not look up when she walked past. Let me tell you about the summer of 2015, because it is the year the argument became undeniable. The drought that came to southwest Kansas in July and August of 2015 was not as acute as the 2012 heat event in terms of peak temperature, but it was more sustained. 6 weeks of temperatures consistently above 95 degrees with below normal precipitation and the particular cruelty of a dry heat that pulls moisture out of everything, pastures and cattle and farmers alike. Hay prices spiked. Water became a management issue, and the cattle that were carrying high metabolic loads from large frames and fast-growth genetics were burning through their body condition reserves at a rate that showed up in the fall weaning weights and in the culling decisions that followed. Across Finney County that fall, the average weaning weight for the county's calf crop was down 43 pounds from the 5-year average, according to the data Nora had requested from the Extension Office. Operations that had experienced the most severe heat stress events showed the largest declines. 2 operations that had been running exclusively continental cross genetics reported weaning weight declines of over 60 pounds per calf. One of them was Harlan Voss. Nora's Shorthorn cross calves weaned at an average of 552 pounds in the fall of 2015. Her straight Angus calves, the portion of the herd she had maintained for comparison purposes, weaned at 549 pounds. For the first time in the trial, the Shorthorn cross calves had outperformed the Angus calves on absolute weaning weight, not just on risk-adjusted economics. She looked at that number for a long time before she wrote it down. Then she wrote it down. The per-head revenue comparison for 2015 was not close. The Shorthorn cross calves generated $112 more per head in net revenue than the Angus calves, accounting for all costs. Across 60 cows, that was $6,720 in additional net revenue from the Shorthorn cross portion of the herd. Across the hypothetical full herd of 180 cows, had she been running Admiral's calves on all of them, it would have been $20,160. She put those numbers in the notebook, and then she put them in a presentation, and she called the Kansas Livestock Association and asked to speak at their annual meeting in January. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley's visit to the Salazar Ranch in October of 2015, because it happened before the KLA meeting, and because it is the scene that this story has been building toward since March of 2011. He drove up the county road in his truck on a Tuesday afternoon and parked at the gate and sat there for a moment before he got out, which Nora saw from the barn where she was sorting calves. She walked over. He was standing at the fence looking at the Shorthorn cross calves in the south pasture. He had his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something and was now deciding whether to say it. He said he'd been looking at his numbers from the summer. He said the drought had hit his operation harder than he'd expected. He said he'd lost ground on his background in calves that he wasn't going to recover before the sale. He said he'd been thinking about what she'd presented at the last 2 Farm Bureau meetings. He said he was wondering whether she had any recommendations on Shorthorn bulls. Nora looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was flat and cool, the way October light is in southwest Kansas, and the calves in the pasture behind her moved slowly toward the water tank. She said, "I thought the Shorthorn bull hadn't been born that could compete with what the Angus AI programs were producing." She said it quietly, without heat, the way you say something you have been saving for a long time because you knew the moment would come and you wanted to say it correctly when it did. Dale Crowley looked at the ground. He said, "I know what I said." Nora said, "The lesson isn't that Shorthorns are better than Angus. The lesson is that any operation running only one genetic type in a climate that varies this much is running a risk it doesn't have to run. The lesson is that the data was there in 2011, and it was still there in 2012, and it was still there after the heat killed Harlan's cattle. And the question worth asking is why it took until 2015 for it to matter to anyone with 4,000 head." She paused. "I'll send you the contact information for the breeder I use in Pratt County. The line has held up. You should look at the EPD data yourself and make your own decision." She went back to sorting calves. Dale Crowley stood at the fence for another minute. Then he got in his truck and drove away. Let me tell you about the Kansas Livestock Association annual meeting in January of 2016, because it is the moment the story moved from Finney County to somewhere larger. Nora presented for 22 minutes to an audience of roughly 300 cattlemen and extension personnel from across southwest and central Kansas. She was 26 years old. She wore a Carhartt jacket and her hair pulled back, and she had a spreadsheet projected on the screen behind her that covered 4 years of performance data, 240 animal seasons of records, and a cost-benefit analysis that had been reviewed by her former advisor at Kansas State before she submitted it to the KLA program committee. She was the youngest presenter on the program. She was the only woman presenting on livestock genetics. She walked through the data the same way she always did, without drama, without apology, letting the numbers carry the argument. She talked about the 2012 heat event and the 2015 drought. She talked about heat load physiology and the OSU and Texas A&M research. She talked about the per-head economics across 4 years and 3 different weather conditions, including the cool year of 2013 when the Shorthorn cross advantage was minimal, because she was not going to hide the year that didn't favor her argument. She said that the question was not whether Shorthorn genetics were universally superior. The question was whether a genetic program designed exclusively for performance in optimal conditions was appropriate for a climate that was demonstrably not optimal for an increasing number of days per year. She said that diversification in genetics, like diversification in crops, was a form of risk management, and that the county had been treating genetic uniformity as a virtue when the data suggested it was a liability. When she finished, there was a silence of about 4 seconds, which is a long silence in a room of 300 people, and then the applause started from the front row, where Emmett Lindgren was sitting, and spread back through the room. Not everyone applauded, but most did. The Extension Service asked her to write up the trial data for publication in their quarterly bulletin. She did. The bulletin reached 4,200 subscribers across western Kansas. 3 months after it was published, she had received 47 phone calls and emails from producers asking about the Shorthorn bull lines she'd used and requesting copies of her data protocol so they could run their own trials. She answered all of them. Miguel Salazar attended the KLA meeting. He sat in the back of the room as he usually did at meetings, with his hands on his knees and his hat in his lap. When Nora finished and the applause started, he stood up. He was the only person in the back of the room who stood. Nora saw him from the podium. She did not say anything about it then. Later, driving home on the highway through the flat dark of a Kansas January, Miguel said that her grandfather would have liked to see that. He said it once and did not elaborate, and Nora understood that it was the most complete thing he knew how to say. Let me tell you about what the Salazar Ranch looks like now, because the story does not end in January of 2016, and it does not end with the KLA bulletin, and it does not end with the 47 phone calls. Nora converted the full cow herd to a Shorthorn cross program by 2017, maintaining a small Angus comparison group for ongoing data purposes. Admiral was retired from active service in 2018 at age 8, sound and calm and unimpressed with his own significance, and was replaced by a son out of a Kansas-bred cow that Nora had selected specifically for heat tolerance EPDs and moderate frame score. The operation has not had a heat-related mortality event since 2012. In the 4 summers between 2017 and 2021 that produced significant heat stress events in Finney County, the Salazar herd's performance data showed consistent advantages in average daily gain maintenance, feed efficiency, and body condition retention during heat periods compared to the county average figures published by the Extension Service. 14 producers in Finney and adjacent counties have adopted Shorthorn or Shorthorn cross bulls as part of their genetic program since 2016. Citing Nora's data as a contributing factor in their decision. 3 of them are operations that were running exclusively Continental Cross Genetics in 2012. One of them is Harlan Voss, who called Nora in the spring of 2017 and asked for the Pratt County breeder's number, and who told her, without being asked, that he'd lost $47,000 in the 2012 heat event, and that he'd driven past her pasture on the 5th day and seen her cattle at the water tank and known then that something was different, even if he hadn't been ready to ask about it yet. Dunmore's Red Admiral is buried at the south end of the pasture where he spent his breeding seasons, under the lone cottonwood that was the first shade he found when he arrived in April of 2011. Nora put a small post there, not a monument, just a marker, because she thought the animal had earned the acknowledgement. The cottonwood is still standing. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has a final chapter that is still being written. In the spring of 2022, Nora's daughter Clara, who was 4 years old and had been following her mother around the ranch since she could walk, asked why they didn't grow sunflowers in the south field that had been in native grass since Aurelio Salazar's time. She had seen sunflowers from the truck window on the highway and wanted to know why they were yellow and whether they could have some. Nora explained that the south field was native grass pasture and that it was part of the ranch's grazing rotation. Clara thought about this and said that the sunflowers on the highway looked happy. Nora laughed. She said she would think about it. She did think about it. She thought about it the way she thinks about everything, which is with a notebook and a literature review and a conversation with her former advisor at Kansas State, who told her that native grass restoration combined with managed rotational grazing and strategic oilseed integration was one of the more interesting areas of current research in sustainable range management in the Southern Plains. She thought about the south field, which had been overgrazed in her grandfather's time and had recovered but had never quite reached the species diversity that the historical record suggested it once had. She thought about the economics of sunflower production in Finney County and the market for high oleic sunflower oil and the soil health data on deep-rooted oilseeds in degraded prairie ground. She thought about what her grandfather had built and what her father had maintained and what she had changed and whether the next change was hers to make or Clara's. In October of 2022, she told Miguel that she was going to plant 12 acres of the south field to a native grass and sunflower polyculture in the spring, using a protocol from a Colorado State research program, and that she wanted to track the soil health metrics over 5 years alongside the grazing data. Miguel looked at her. He was 61 years old and had been farming for 40 years and had watched his daughter be right about something that everyone told her she was wrong about, and he had stood up in the back of a room in January of 2016 when the applause started. He said yes before she finished the sentence. Clara Salazar is 6 years old now. She already has opinions about the sunflowers. Nora planted shorthorns in an Angus county. They laughed. The heat came. The Angus struggled. The shorthorn cross calves stood at the water tank. The notebook was right. The ground always knew.